Lampton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to say that I'll be sharing my time with the member from Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. And certainly I'm pleased to rise in this House to speak about Bill C-46, an act to amend the criminal code and make consequential amendments to other acts, also known as the impaired driving legislation. As you know, this bill is the accompanying legislation to C-45, the legalization of marijuana, which I studied at Health Committee with my honourable colleague from Vancouver Kingsway. And so this particular bill, C-46, is seeking to create new and higher mandatory fines and maximum penalties for impaired driving, as well as to authorize mandatory roadside screening for alcohol. Well, I'm in favor of taking a strong stance against impaired driving, but there is so much wrong in this bill that I'm not sure I can cover all of what's wrong in just 10 minutes, but I'll give it a try. First of all, I said many times in this House, and I'll say it every single day, there's only 246 days left until the government intends to pick this arbitrary date and legalize marijuana. The provinces, the police, and the municipalities have been clear they're not ready. When this legislation finishes in this House, which will take some time, it needs to go then to the Senate. And if the Senate amends it, it will come back to this House. And when it's finally finalized, that's when the provinces can have certainty about their legislation that needs to line up to this legislation. And when the provinces' legislation is finished, that's when the municipalities can have their legislation to line up to the provincial legislation to line up to the federal legislation. And it's at the municipal level that many concerns have been expressed about this bill, because it's the local police that are going to have to address, the impaired drug driving issue. Now, we already have a big problem with impaired driving. We have, right now, 16% of traffic fatalities are related to alcohol-impaired driving. 24% are related to drug-impaired driving, of which the most frequent kind is marijuana. And then there's another 18% that's a combination of the two. Now, if we take a look at other jurisdictions that have legalized marijuana, all of them saw an increase. In Washington State, their fatalities from drug-impaired driving from marijuana doubled. In Colorado, it increased by 32%. And so there's going to be a lot more of these impaired things to deal with. And with that in mind, it's extremely troubling that there's no test for impairment. This government always talks about being fact and evidence-based and taking a science-based approach. Well, here's what the science can do. Today, the science can detect THC in the saliva. The science can detect THC in the blood. But there is no research or correlation that says whether or not that relates to impairment. There's a number of factors that are at play. For example, someone who is on medicinal marijuana that may be taking a huge dosage on a long-term basis may always have THC show up, but may be so used to it in their system that they are not impaired, in fact. There are other people who may have experienced secondhand smoke, for example, that may have THC show up in their blood, but they are also not impaired. And so this legislation, by coming ahead of the science that we would need to have a test where you could actually say one way or the other if somebody was impaired from marijuana, is just irresponsible. The training that's required for police officers, the drug recognition training that we would need. The police have said they'll probably need about 2,000 of those types across the country. Right now we've got 600. So to train 1,400 people, this is not just a one-day training. This training requires multiple sessions, and a lot of those sessions happen in the United States. And you can appreciate that the United States training sessions are all booked up because of all the states that are legalizing marijuana. So for that reason, in the next 246 days, I find it really hard to believe that we're going to have the 1,400 police officers trained to the level that they need to be trained in order to do the job. Municipalities testified to us at Health Committee and talked about the lack of resources and the lack of understanding on the part of the Liberal government of what rural reality is. One municipality testified that they've got 9 RCMP total to cover everything in a very wide-spaced riding. And so if there's somebody that's impaired and suspected of being impaired from marijuana, that RCMP agent would have to accompany that person to the next jurisdiction where the only available blood testing would be available and stay with them until the results are known. And so they're considering this to be a huge burden on their resourcing, and of course that has not been taken into account. Every one of the places that has legalized marijuana has strongly advised Canada that one of the learnings that they had was you need to do the public awareness and education before you legalize. And that was not disputed by anyone. We know that the amount of money that was spent was about $10 million in Colorado for a population of 5 million. We know it was $7 million that was spent in Washington for a population of 7 million. But in Canada, this government has pledged $9.8 million over 5 years for a population that's north of 30 million. So it's completely inadequate, and certainly they haven't even started to roll it out. There's 246 days left, and the Public Education Awareness RFP just came in with the bids on October 16th of this year. And so the program hasn't been created, the program is not being rolled out, and it was a key advice from everybody we heard from that you have to have that in place before you legalize. So you would think the government would do the responsible thing to do, protect public safety, and say, look, when we get all of these things in place, then we'll legalize. But no, they're rushing ahead towards this July 1st, 2018 arbitrary date. So, one of the other topics of discussion that I find a little bit hypocritical in this bill is the mandatory and random testing. Now, to give you some history from my background, obviously I was Director of Engineering and Construction in the petrochemical industry. And if you look at places like the United States, they will mandatory medical screen employees before they're hired to a job, and they have the right to random test or mandatory test as they choose on those employees at any time. When I was with Dow Chemical, I had an office in Midland, Michigan, and when I went there, I was subjected to random tests because that's the law of the land there. And so there's a real concern, obviously, when you have plants that have dangerous nature, like nuclear plants or chemical plants or petrochemical facilities, where you don't want to have people that are high on marijuana operating those facilities. Then because the employer has the whole liability, they ought to have the ability to do something. But in Anne McClellan's report on marijuana and how the government should move forward with legalization, they did include a section on this because they did hear testimony from the employers across the country that this was of concern. And yet there were only a couple of lines in their report with recommendations, and the Liberal government refused to adopt any of this. So I think it's quite hypocritical that they could say, well, we need to have mandatory testing or be able to have random testing because it's dangerous to drive a car, and not say the same thing for operating a nuclear plant or operating a chemical plant or perhaps driving a huge train. We had the Railway Association here this week, and of course I'm the co-chair of Parliamentary Rail, and they're extremely concerned that they've not been allowed to implement any kind of random testing. Now, there are some promising precedents. There was a TTC case where the courts did allow them, because of the prevalence of drug use, to start random testing. And there was another case, just one recently by Suncor, which allowed that kind of testing. But I think we have to be consistent in our approach. So if I see that it's okay for doing roadside mandatory testing or random testing, then it ought, in fact, to be done as well. That's assuming, of course, that we ever come with a test that can actually show impairment, which I've already talked about, the fact that we don't have that. So what else I would say is that when we think about the impaired drug driving, the message has not gotten out there, especially to the young people. In the 18 to 35 demographic, 40% are consuming cannabis. They do not recognize that it's harmful to them. They don't understand that 30% of them that use it under the age of 25 will come with schizophrenia, psychotic disorders, depression, or anxiety, which are lifetime conditions. And they certainly don't understand that it's hazardous to get behind the wheel of a car when you've been smoking marijuana. And so I have a huge concern with this bill for that reason, and I urge the government to do the right thing, protect the Canadian public, do it right, don't do it fast, quit rushing, and wait until the test exists. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for the contribution she makes to our health committee. She's a strong and well-informed voice in the committee. I'd like to congratulate her, I think, also on a very well-informed speech that points out some of the serious issues with this bill. You know, I think it's a fair comment to say that the whole issue of cannabis has been handled by the Liberal government from the beginning as a political issue. It was a political statement made by the Prime Minister when he was leader of the Liberal Party, and I think they found themselves surprisingly in majority government, and they've been rushing ever since to roll this out. And the reason I say that is because expert after expert, stakeholder after stakeholder, person after person who comes before this committee or this Parliament and talks about the issues contradicts some of the major tenets that lie underneath the government's legislation. So I'd like to ask my honourable colleague a question about one of those things, and that is on the limits. She commented on the difficulty of proving impairment. What does she think the impact of this bill will be if it turns out to give Canadians criminal records for driving while impaired when they're actually not impaired?
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for a very good question. You know, there will be people legitimately that will be charged under this legislation if they set a per se limit. Now, if you don't know what impairment level is, it might be logical to set a per se limit of 0, which some jurisdictions have done. Colorado arbitrarily set 0.05, that's fine. But if you're a medicinal marijuana user, and there are a lot of people across the country that are using medicinal marijuana to address epilepsy, to address sleep disorders, to address chronic pain issues, and those people will have THC in their system. They would test positive, they would be charged with impaired because their levels will be relatively high depending on the consumption that they have. Those are examples of folks then that would have a criminal record when they don't actually deserve to have that criminal record. And the same point could be made for those with secondhand smoke. And so I do think that there will be a lot of court challenges, not only because there's no science to say what impairment is, but there will be a lot of people that are actually not impaired that will be charged. And this will tie up our courts at a time when murderers and sex offenders are going free because we don't have enough judges because the Justice Minister has not appointed them. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Beaches, East York, is it?
Thanks very much, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for her speech and would note that I'm welcoming one of her constituents, my father-in-law, up for lunch shortly. I would sympathize with some of the comments of the members, particularly with respect to medicinal cannabis patients and the extra burden on our criminal justice system. I would note, though, when the member cautions against proceeding quickly with cannabis legalization, Colorado and other jurisdictions certainly moved faster than we are. I think we are actually taking our time and proceeding with some caution. I would also wonder what the member might say to the fact that over 43% of Canadians self-report using cannabis in their lifetimes. That's self-report, so the number is obviously higher. People are already on the roads impaired from cannabis use, and we don't have any regulations in place to deal with that. And so perhaps these are not the appropriate regulations, but does she not view that as a concern? And is this not a better approach? Some regulation, perhaps not perfect regulation, but some regulation rather than a complete and total absence.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for that question. He is quite right that 43% of Canadians will say in their lifetime they've tried cannabis, but another great statistic is that currently 88% of Canadians do not use marijuana. Okay? And those are the Canadians that are going to get these unintended consequences from the rush. So whether you're on the side of, you should legalize or you shouldn't legalize, the real thing is how do we protect the public, how do we protect the children, and how do we do this in a sensible way? And so why is the Liberal government rushing with the 246 days left? It's because of that voting demographic, the 18 to 35-year-olds, of which 40% use marijuana. That's the biggest voting demographic. This government had a campaign promise that they were going to get legalized on it. They've been 2 years in the making here. In 2 years, they've done nothing on the public education. They've done nothing to prepare this public for the increase in impaired drug driving that will be seen. And so I would just encourage the member opposite to encourage his caucus to slow down, because they've had 2 years and they're not prepared.
Here, here.
Reprise de débat. Resuming debate. L'honorable député de Charles.
The honourable member for Fashionable, Saint-Charles. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak to Bill C-46, an act to amend the criminal code and to make consequential amendments to other acts. I would like to start by explaining just how deficient this bill is. When I read it, it raised many questions and had few answers. So many questions and few answers, just like the situation of the Minister of Finance and Morneau Chappelle. The bill was the subject of a great deal of enthusiasm, but there's not enough detail. This bill lacks logical details. Did the minister really take the time to read this bill before tabling it? No one in this place doubts the competency of the minister and staff, but there's something wrong here. If the minister had presented this text to say that the bill was still being drafted and was ready to welcome our ideas to make it better, I would have said it's a good idea, we'll work together, but that's not what happened. The Liberal government is not at all interested in hearing our amendments or ideas or from other opposition parties. In fact, you can witness the way that Liberals rarely answer the most basic questions. Most of their speeches are platitudes and empty promises. They talk about helping the middle class, but while they increase their taxes and tries to withdraw tax credits for the most vulnerable, they give millions to a terrorist but can't find a few thousand to clear the snow on the Holocaust monument. They want to legalize drugs knowing that the provinces are going to pay the bill. When it comes to the provinces, this is nothing new for the Liberals. Not so long ago, the Liberals had reduced the federal financial contribution for health care. They cut the contribution in order to balance the federal budget. At the time, the federal contribution to the provinces was almost 50%, and the Liberals reduced it to 14%. According to a Romanoff study, which made them go back on their decision. At the time, they bragged that their Minister of Finance was the best financial manager in the G7. But one does not have to be a very good manager to send the bill to somebody else, like the provinces. And it's the same situation as this one, Bill C-46, which will legalize marijuana. When it comes to the bill, we know that there's a lot of details that are missing, and the government needs to look at it more seriously. 2 years ago, we said that the Prime Minister was just not ready to govern. 2 years later, we have proof that he's still not ready. It's true that he has really nice, fashionable socks, and that he's been known as the selfie wonder, but that's not enough to govern our country. The Prime Minister is surrounded by MPs who seem to have memory problems. For example, his Minister of Finance did not remember that was the owner of a villa in France that was worth millions of dollars. And furthermore, a member who represents Peterborough, Kawartha, could not remember where they were born. The former Minister of Defense no longer remembered his role in Kandahar. That's just the beginning. 2 years ago, the Prime Minister declared that his government was going to have a very small, tiny $10 billion deficit, and where are we now? We see that the Prime Minister didn't remember his promise because his government is spending as though there was no tomorrow, and the country's debt continues to grow. This bill that we have today gives us another example of the lack of preparation and the lack of seriousness from the Liberals. First of all, what he's proposing is far from a complete bill. Once again, Mr. Speaker, the text forces us to ask questions that the government cannot answer. When I read it, I asked, how is it possible that the minister decided to go forward with a bill in its current form? Madam Speaker, now, we've heard the testimony of many witnesses, and I can tell you that their comments are not taken into account in this bill. For example, minimum fines for driving when driving under the influence causes harm or death are extremely low. This does not show a good balance between civilian rights and public safety. As Canadians, it's true that we have laws, but we have to act responsibly. Having a driver's license is a privilege. It is not a right. We need to send a clear message that one person dying because of somebody driving under the influence is extremely serious. Through efforts implemented by every level of government and groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving to educate the public about the consequences of driving a car under the influence, we see now that we have a government that is implementing a bill without taking the safety of Canadians seriously, and it makes no sense. Throughout their history, it's clear that the Liberals have always been concerned for the rights of criminals rather than for those who respect the law. Recently, we saw this Liberal government give $10 million to a terrorist. The Liberals, did the tribunals order the Liberals to do this? No, but they did it anyway. Was the terrorist expecting money? I doubt it. But the message of the Trudeau government is that crime pays. That's what we have learned from it. Did the Prime Minister really think about making that decision?
In addition, this bill appears reasonable at first, but there's no clear information or training to be provided the police. How are the police going to effectively determine whether a person is impaired by drugs and how impaired they are? So this bill is not a finished product. If a police officer can't determine whether a driver's over a given level, they can do that with alcohol, but they won't be able to do it with drugs. The technology does not allow us to determine when drugs were actually taken. You can determine the level, but not the timing. So when someone smokes a joint every hour or 2 hours, how are they supposed to know when their body has processed that drug? So this bill is not adequate. At committee, the Minister of Public Safety said that organized crime generates over $7 billion with the marijuana trade alone every year. So now the government will be in a position to put a tax on the sale of marijuana, and so that money will come into government coffers. So we understand where the Liberals' interest lies. What's most important to them is a new source of revenues. That's it, that's all. Let's be honest, Madam Speaker. This government can't continue spending recklessly without finding new revenue sources. A few days ago, the finance minister gave an economic update. There's no strategy, once again, for returning to balanced books. We are parliamentarians in one of the largest countries in the world, a G7 country. This is no way to run the ship. What's going to happen if we fall back into recession? Of course, the economy is cyclical and things might be going relatively well now, but what's the government going to do when the economy slows down? Did they ever think about that? It may be that there will be no slowdown under, while the Liberals are at the helm, they might just get lucky. There may be no problem for them. But seriously, Madam Speaker, maybe they think it's going to be someone else's problem after them. But they have a duty to govern with diligence and discipline, and we're not sure the Prime Minister understands the importance of his role. We know that he likes photo ops and grandstanding at the UN, But for the rest, it's not so clear. Canadians have rights, but rights, the flip side of rights is responsibilities, and drivers have responsibilities. The Liberals are in a rush to pass C-45 and C-46 because they need money, they need revenue. But our police forces have repeatedly said that they're not ready, they're not prepared, they need to hire experts, they need to train officers on the use of new technologies. This cannot all be in place by July 1st. The police know it, we know it, and even the Liberals know it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments?
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. You know, one of the major concerns about this bill has to do with the ability of the police to randomly stop someone without any just cause and potentially to have that power misused. I know that our leader, Jagmeet Singh, has brought to the federal national stage the issue of racial profiling. And at our health committee, when we were studying the cannabis bill, we heard firsthand evidence from sociologists across this country and other experts about the disproportionate impact of criminalization on marginalized groups like racialized Canadians, young Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, poor Canadians. So I'm just wondering if my honourable colleague has any thoughts or concerns about this bill's provisions that may make it easier for police to randomly stop people without any just cause, and whether that power may be misused to target racialized, poor, Indigenous or otherwise marginalized Canadians.
The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I covered that in my speech. There's a flagrant problem between managing public safety and civil rights. We're in a gray area here. The police officers are going to have to enforce new legislation, but with a lack of tools, a lack of clarity. And so once again, this is, and I'd like to thank my NDP colleague for his question, it's yet more evidence of why this bill is not at all ready to be implemented. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I listened very carefully to my colleague's speech, and I'd like to commend his great experience. He's done a great job in this arena and has been doing so since he was made a minister in the shadow cabinet for public safety. And I think government colleagues should listen to what he's saying about how this is all being by the seat of the pants they're doing this, and that there's a lack of time to implement this properly. We're in favor of everything that can be done to reduce impaired driving, whether it's impaired by alcohol or drugs. But, Madam Speaker, with Bill C-45, that's not going to solve the problem. It's actually going to exacerbate the problem unless the necessary resources are provided the police. Does my colleague agree with that? The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Mégantic-L'Érable for his question. That question is further evidence that the government has no idea where it's going. There was a bill that came from the Senate on drug-impaired driving. It was all ready to go, it was complete and so on, and the government decided to vote it down. Here, we've got a completely seat-of-the-pants, bungled kind of piece of legislation, and the government wants to steamroll it through, no problem. So yeah, there's another problem to deal with here, and that is government mismanagement. Questions and comments?
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to our honourable colleague across the way. A far-ranging and wide-ranging speech that he gave on very many topics apart from Bill C-46. But back to the bill at hand, it seems like the honourable member would like to have us do nothing, similar to the economic management of the previous government. Is that the approach that he'd like us to take?
The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. You've got about 10 seconds. 1 minute to answer. 1 minute, okay. Well, thanks for listening to my speech. I'm glad you listened. Oh, sorry, Madam Speaker. I may have lumped a whole bunch of things together because there's a connection between C-45 and C-46. the minister said we need to pass C45. So C45, there was a rush, and C46, it's not ready. It's not that we don't want to do anything about this problem, but we want it to work properly. We want to get it right. Thank you.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat.